The stagecoach lurched to a halt with a groan of old wood and tired iron sending a cloud of brown dust spiraling into the late October sky above Elkhorn, Montana territory. Emmett Calloway climbed down on stiff legs, his leather traveling bag clutched in one hand, his body aching from 6 days of continuous rattling across half a continent. He stood in the muddy street and looked at the town that was supposed to be his new beginning. And his first thought was that beginnings had no business looking this bleak. Elkhorn was not much of a town. A single main street carved through the valley floor, flanked by buildings that leaned into each other like drunks supporting one another home. A general store. A saloon with no name painted on its sign, just the faded ghost of letters that had surrendered to weather long ago. A land office. A church with a crooked steeple. Beyond the buildings, the mountains rose in every direction, massive and indifferent, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. Emmett adjusted his spectacles, pushed them higher on the bridge of his nose, and felt the weight of every mile between this place and Boston. Back there, he had been a teacher, a man who bound books with careful hands and shaped young minds with patient words. A man who believed that truth and decency would prevail because that was what the books promised. The books had been wrong about a great many things. He walked toward the saloon because it was the only establishment showing signs of life at this hour. The door swung open on a hinge that screamed for oil, and inside half a dozen men looked up from their drinks with the particular suspicion that frontier people reserved for anyone who arrived wearing a vest and polished shoes. The bartender was a broad man with forearms like fence posts and eyes that measured Emmett the way a butcher measures a cut of meat. "What can I get you?" "Just information," Emmett said. He pulled the crumpled advertisement from his coat pocket, the one he had carried across 2,000 miles of track and road and dust. The paper was soft at the folds, the ink blurred from his own sweat, but the words were still legible. He did not need to read them. He had memorized every syllable weeks ago. "I am looking for the Sinclair homestead. Hadley Sinclair. I believe she placed this advertisement in the Boston Herald." The bartender stared at him. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but one soaked in the kind of pity that stings worse than cruelty. "The Sinclair girls. You are the one who answered that." "I am." A man at the corner table spoke without looking up from his whiskey. "Friend, let me save you some trouble. Turn around, get back on that stagecoach, and go home to wherever you came from. Those women will eat you alive before sundown." Another man chuckled. "3 of them up there on that mountain, wild as the deer and twice as stubborn. Their daddy raised them like sons, and the mountains finished the job. No man in this territory has managed to stick around longer than a week." Emmett stood very still. He was familiar with this kind of discouragement, had received it from his headmaster in Boston, who told him he was not smart enough for university, from the police who told him Cornelius Marsh was too powerful to accuse, from the doctors who told him his sister Nell would not survive the winter. He had learned that people who told you something was impossible were usually telling you more about themselves than about the situation. "I appreciate the advice," he said evenly. "Now can someone tell me how to get there?" The bartender shook his head but gave directions. 3 hours on horseback northwest following the creek until it forked, then taking the left branch into the high country. The trail would narrow to almost nothing. When he saw the split rail fence with a horseshoe nailed above the gate, he had arrived. "You will want to rent a horse from Jessup at the livery," the bartender added. "And a word of advice, friend. When you get up there and they point a rifle at you, and they will point a rifle at you, do not make any sudden movements." Emmett rented a horse, a patient brown mare named Birch, who seemed to understand that her rider was not skilled at riding and compensated accordingly. He loaded his traveling bag, his trunk of books, and bookbinding tools, and the last letter his sister had ever written to him, sealed in an oilskin pouch against his chest. Then he rode out of Elkhorn and into the mountains, and the town disappeared behind him like a memory he was already forgetting. The trail was everything the bartender had warned and worse. It climbed steeply through pine forests so thick the afternoon sun became a rumor. The air thinned and cooled, carrying the scent of coming snow and old earth, and something wild that Emmett could not name. Twice Birch stopped and refused to move until he dismounted and led her past sections where the path had crumbled down the mountainside. Once he heard something large moving through the trees to his left, and his heart hammered so hard he was certain the animal could hear it. But he kept moving. Forward was the only direction that made sense anymore. Behind him lay Boston with its false accusations and its legal machinery grinding him to dust. Behind him lay the empty room where Nell had drawn her last breath, her hand in his, her voice thin as paper whispering, "Find a place where they judge a man by what he does, not what others say about him." Behind him lay everything that had broken him. Ahead lay whatever this was. He preferred whatever this was. The fence appeared as the light was turning golden, the sun dropping toward the western peaks. A split-rail fence hand-built and solid running along a ridge with views that stopped his breath. Mountains folded into mountains, valley after valley, the whole vast wilderness rolling to the horizon in shades of green and gold and gray. And there, nailed above the gate, a single horseshoe turned upward to catch luck. Emmett dismounted, tied Birch to the fence, and walked through the gate. The homestead spread across a natural shelf of land protected on three sides by rock and forest. A log cabin not large, but built with obvious care, its chimney trailing wood smoke into the sky. A barn, a chicken coop, a garden now harvested and turned for winter, its neat rows speaking of discipline and knowledge. A corral holding 3 horses and a mule. Everything maintained, everything purposeful, everything built by people who understood that survival in this country was not a gift, but a daily negotiation. He had taken perhaps 10 steps toward the cabin when the rifle shot split the air. Not near enough to hit him, close enough to stop him. He froze, hands instinctively rising. A woman emerged from the cabin's shadow, and even at a distance, even with a rifle leveled at his chest, Emmett registered that she was striking. Not in the way Boston women were striking, all powdered and arranged. Striking the way the mountains behind her were striking, all with her raw force and unapologetic presence. She was tall for a woman, athletic, with chestnut brown hair, pulled back in a rough braid from which strands escaped in every direction. Her face was sun-bronzed and sharp-featured, with green eyes that looked at him the way a hawk looks at a field mouse, deciding whether the effort of diving is worth the meal. "State your business," she called, her voice carrying clear across the distance. "You are on Sinclair land." Emmett lowered his hand slowly. "My name is Emmett Calloway. I have come from Boston. I believe you placed an advertisement seeking a husband." The rifle did not move. The green eyes did not soften. Another figure appeared from behind the barn, a second woman slightly shorter with dark honey blonde hair and amber-colored eyes that held a warmth the first woman's lacked. She carried a bucket and wore an expression of cautious curiosity. And then a third figure materialized on the barn roof as if she had grown from the wooden shingles themselves. Younger than the other two, with red auburn hair blazing in the late sun, gray-blue eyes full of storm balanced on the ridgepole with the ease of a cat. She held a knife. The knife came down before Emmett could fully register the motion. It sliced through the air and embedded itself in the dirt 3 inches from his right boot, the handle vibrating with the force of impact. He looked at the knife. He looked up at the girl on the roof. She was grinning, a wild challenge in her face, waiting for him to flinch, to yelp, to prove that the city man was everything she expected him to be. Emmett studied the knife's position relative to the nearest fence post. "Your aim is about 2 inches off if you were going for the wood," he said. The grin faltered. The girl on the roof tilted her head. The woman with the rifle had not lowered it. She was looking at Emmett the way someone looks at a horse that they have been promised is broke to ride, but suspect is nothing of the sort. Her eyes traveled from his face to his dust-covered dress boots, his wrinkled vest, his hands that were clearly more accustomed to holding a pen than a plow. Everything about her expression communicated a single devastating verdict: disappointment. She lowered the rifle finally. Not because she trusted him, but because she had decided he was not dangerous enough to justify the bullet. "Cora," she said without turning, "bring him some water. He looks about ready to fall over." The blonde woman, Cora, offered a gentle smile that felt like the first kindness Emmett had received in 1,000 miles. "Come inside," she said. "You must be exhausted from the journey." The girl on the roof dropped to the ground with the fluid grace of someone who had been climbing since she could walk. She retrieved her knife, slid it into a sheath on her belt, and followed them toward the cabin, her gray eyes never leaving Emmett, watching him the way a wolf watches something it has not yet decided to trust. Inside the cabin, Emmett sat at a rough-hewn table and drank water that tasted like cold stone and pine needles, while 3 pairs of eyes studied him from across the room. The cabin was clean and well organized, the work of people who had no room for disorder. Herbs hung drying from the rafters. A rifle and two shotguns rested on pegs above the door. Books, a small shelf of them, caught Emmett's eye and surprised him. The eldest woman, the one with the rifle, sat across from him. Her name was Hadley, and she spoke with the directness of someone who had lost all patience for the roundabout customs of polite society. The blonde was Cora, 24, who moved around the kitchen, preparing food with quiet efficiency. The redhead was Wren, 19, who had retreated to a corner where she sat sharpening her knife with slow, deliberate strokes, each scrape of metal against stone, clearly intended to unsettle him. Hadley laid out the terms. She spoke of them as terms, not as marriage, not as partnership, not as anything remotely resembling the union that word implied. Emmett would sign the legal documents establishing him as the male head of the Sinclair homestead, satisfying territorial law. In exchange, he received shelter food and a small parcel of land when the arrangement concluded. He would sleep in the barn. He would perform whatever labor they required. He would not issue orders, would not presume authority, would not touch any of the three sisters. This is not a romance, Hadley said, her green eyes flat and unyielding. This is a transaction. You are a name on a document, nothing more. Emmett listened to everything. He looked at the cabin, at the careful construction, at the tools hanging on their proper hooks, at the three women who ran this homestead through sheer force of will. Then he asked the question that changed the air in the room. Who is trying to take your land? The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Heavier, loaded with something old and painful. Hadley's expression shifted. For just a moment, behind the iron, in the stubbornness, Emmett saw surprise. Nobody told you, she said. Nobody needed to tell me. Three capable women do not advertise for a husband out of loneliness. You need a legal name, which means someone is challenging your claim. And given the quality of this homestead, the location, the resources, they are not challenging it because the land is worthless. They are challenging it because it is valuable. Cora set down the plate she had been carrying. Wren's knife stopped scraping. Hadley stared at him for a long time, and Emmett could see calculations running behind her eyes, reassessing, recalibrating. He was not what she had expected. He was not what any of them had expected. It was Cora who answered. Our father, Silas Sinclair, was killed 5 years ago. Everyone in Elkhorn knows Douglas Whitfield was behind it, but nobody will say so publicly. Whitfield owns the largest ranch in the valley and controls half the officials in the territory. Since our father died, Whitfield has been pressuring us to sell, and when we refused, he began making legal claims that our homestead is invalid because there is no male owner of record. Emmett understood. The law written by men for men required a male name on homestead documents in most territories. These women had been surviving on borrowed time, their father's name growing less and less sufficient with each year. Whitfield has people inside the land office, Hadley said, her voice tight with controlled anger. He has been altering records, fabricating claims. We have fought every challenge, but they keep coming, and we cannot fight in court without money we do not have. Emmett sat with this. He thought about his sister, about her letter, about the promise he had made to find a place where he could be useful. He thought about Cornelius Marsh, another powerful man who had twisted systems to destroy someone who stood in his way. The pattern was so familiar it felt like coming home to the worst kind of house. I will sign your papers, he said, and I will help you fight him. Hadley's eyebrows rose. You fight Douglas Whitfield. I cannot ride a horse worth a damn, and I have never fired a rifle in my life. But I can read legal documents better than anyone in this territory, and I know how men like Whitfield operate because one just like him destroyed my life in Boston. I know where to look for the forgeries and the false filings and the paper trails that men like him always leave behind because they never believe anyone will bother to look. More silence. Wren had stopped sharpening entirely, the knife balanced on her knee, watching him with narrowed eyes. Why did you really come here? Hadley asked. Not to Montana, here, to this mountain, to answer an advertisement from strangers. Emmett met her eyes. Because my sister died 6 months ago. She was the last person alive who gave a damn about me. And before she died, she told me to find a place where people judged a man by what he did not, what was said about him. He paused. I have nowhere else to go, but I have skills that might be useful to you, and I would rather spend whatever time I have left doing something that matters than rotting in a cell for a crime I did not commit. Hadley considered this. She looked at Cora, who gave a small nod. She looked at Wren, who shrugged with aggressive indifference. Then she reached across the table with her hand extended, and Emmett shook it. Her grip was iron. "Welcome to the Sinclair homestead, Mr. Calloway. Try not to die in the first week." That first night, Emmett lay on a pile of straw in the barn, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like horses and old hay, staring at the darkness above him and listening to sounds he had never heard before. The creak of trees and wind, the distant howl of something that might have been a wolf or might have been the mountain itself breathing. The shift and stomp of horse in their stalls, their warm bodies generating the only heat in the barn besides his own. He was cold, he was sore. He was 2,000 miles from everything familiar in a place where three women with rifles had made it abundantly clear that his presence was tolerated, not welcomed. And yet, lying there in the dark, Emmett felt something he had not felt since before Nell's diagnosis, before the accusations, before his entire world collapsed. He felt purpose, faint as a single candle in a cathedral, but there. Sometime past midnight, a sound pulled him from thin sleep. Not the horses, not the wind, something smaller. He rose quietly, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the moonlight. She was sitting by the creek behind the cabin. Cora, alone in the silver light, her arms wrapped around her middle, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Emmett's instinct was to retreat, to respect her privacy, to not intrude on grief he had no right to witness. But something held him. The memory of sitting beside Nell's bed during those last weeks, of how the loneliest part of suffering was not the pain itself, but the feeling that no one saw it. He walked to the creek and sat down on a rock, a respectful distance from her, close enough to be present, far enough to not presume. For a long moment he said nothing, just sat with her in the cold, in the moonlight, two damaged people sharing the particular silence of those who have been hurt too deeply for words. "My sister used to say," Emmett began, then stopped. Started again. "Nell, my sister Nell, she used to say that sadness gets lighter when someone sits beside you, even if that person does not say a word." Cora looked at him. In the moonlight, her amber eyes were luminous and wet, and something about the way she held herself, the careful way she lowered herself to sit as though guarding something fragile, and the memory of hearing her retching behind the barn that first morning when she thought no one was awake yet, triggered a recognition in Emmett that assembled itself from small observations rather than any single revelation. She was pregnant. He said nothing about it, did not let his eyes drop to her belly, did not change his expression, did not ask the questions that crowded forward in his mind. He simply sat, and after a while Cora's tears slowed and her breathing steadied, and she whispered into the darkness between them, "Please do not tell Hadley." Emmett nodded once. "Your secret is safe." She looked at him with something that might have been the first stirring of trust, fragile and uncertain, like a green shoot pushing through frozen ground. Then she stood, wiped her face with her sleeve, and walked back to the cabin without another word. Emmett remained by the creek for a long time, listening to the water move over stones, thinking about secrets and the terrible weight of carrying them alone. The days that followed established a pattern. Emmett woke before dawn, stiff and sore from the barn floor, and threw himself into whatever work needed doing. The list was endless. Fences to mend firewood, to split water, to haul from the creek, before the pipes froze, animals to feed, ground to prepare for winter. He was terrible at nearly everything. His hands trained for the delicate work of setting type, and stitching spines blistered and bled from the axe handle. His back, accustomed to hunching over desks, screamed from hours of hauling and lifting. His legs, shaped by city streets, burned from climbing mountain terrain that the sisters navigated without effort. Wren took particular delight in his struggles. She would appear at the worst moments, perched on a fence rail or leaning against a tree, watching him fail with undisguised satisfaction. "That is not how you split wood," she would say. "My grandmother could lift more than that. You call that a fence post? A strong wind would knock it sideways." Emmett bore it without complaint. He bore everything without complaint. When his blisters opened and blood ran between his fingers, he wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working. When his back seized so badly he could not straighten, he worked bent over until it released. When Wren's mockery grew sharp enough to draw blood of a different kind, he absorbed it the way stone absorbs rain, without reaction, without resentment, letting it run off and disappear. And slowly and perceptibly he improved. His calluses hardened, his muscles found new shapes. His body, pushed beyond everything it had known, began to adapt to this brutal new world. with the quiet stubbornness that was perhaps the truest thing about Emmett Calloway. But his real value lay elsewhere, and it revealed itself within the first week. Hadley had kept all of her father's documents in a metal strongbox beneath the floorboards. Land deeds survey, maps, letters from the territorial office, tax receipts. She brought them out one evening and spread them on the table, her expression suggesting she expected Emmett to be as baffled by them as she was. Instead, Emmett sat down, adjusted his spectacles, and began reading with the focused intensity of a man who had spent his life making sense of words on paper. His eyes moved across the documents, his fingers tracing lines of text, cross-referencing dates and signatures. After 2 hours of silence so deep that even Wren stopped fidgeting, he looked up. "3 of these signatures are forged," he said. He pointed to specific documents with a steady finger. "This deed transfer was filed with a signature that does not match your father's writing on any of the earlier documents. The pen pressure is different. The letter spacing is wrong. Someone copied his signature, but did it poorly. And this survey report from 1884, the one that says the property boundaries overlap with Whitfield's claim. The surveyor's name listed here, a man called Bennett. I would wager every book I own that if we check the records, there was no surveyor by that name working in this territory in 1884. Hadley stared at the papers, then at him. Her expression underwent a subtle transformation, like the first crack in ice that precedes a thaw. She did not say thank you. She did not acknowledge that she had underestimated him. But something in the set of her shoulders changed, and when she spoke, the edge in her voice had softened by the smallest degree. "What else did you find?" Emmett organized the papers into careful stacks, enough to raise serious questions with a fair-minded judge. Not enough yet to bring formal charges. "We need the original filing records from the land office in town. If Whitfield altered these copies, the originals might still show the truth, assuming he has not gotten to them first." "He has people in the land office," Hadley reminded him. "Then we need to be smarter than his people." 2 weeks after Emmett's arrival, Douglas Whitfield came to the Sinclair homestead in person. He rode up the mountain trail on a black stallion that cost more than everything the Sinclair sisters owned, combined, flanked by his foreman, a thick-necked man named Gruber, and another ranch hand who carried a rifle with the casual ease of someone who used it often. Whitfield was a tall man, silver-haired, with a face carved from the same granite as the mountains. He wore expensive clothes that somehow looked natural on him, as if the wilderness itself had decided to dress up. His eyes were the color of cold water, and they held the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He dismounted and surveyed the homestead with the proprietary gaze of someone inspecting property he already considered his own. Then his eyes found Emmett standing by the woodpile in his shirt sleeves, his eastern boots caked with mud, his vest spotted with sawdust, his spectacles catching the autumn light. Whitfield smiled the way a cat smiles at something small. "So this is the husband," he said, not to Emmett, but to Hadley, who had emerged from the cabin with her rifle. She did not point it at him, but she held it in a way that communicated she could. "Mr. Whitfield," Hadley said. "Miss Sinclair." Whitfield tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard you had taken a novel approach to your legal difficulties. Importing a husband from back east." He looked at Emmett again. "A school teacher, if the gossip is accurate, and a bookbinder. How delightfully creative." Emmett set down the axe he had been using and walked forward. He did not rush, did not hesitate, just walked with the steady pace of a man who has decided that the time for being afraid has passed. "Mr. Whitfield, I have heard a great deal about you. I am sure you have, and I am sure very little of it was flattering, given the source." Whitfield's smile did not waver. "I will be direct, Mr. Calloway. I know what this arrangement is. A paper marriage to satisfy a legal technicality. Any court in the territory will see through it in an instant. A Boston school teacher who has never set foot west of the Mississippi suddenly marries a mountain woman he has never met. The story writes itself." Emmett adjusted his spectacles. "You may be right about the courts, Mr. Whitfield. But while we are discussing what courts might see, I wonder what they would make of a forged survey document filed under the name of a surveyor who never existed." The smile vanished from Whitfield's face as if someone had blown out a candle. His cold eyes narrowed, and for the first time Emmett saw the predator behind the polished surface. The temperature between them dropped 10 degrees. "You want to be very careful about what you accuse me of, boy. I am not accusing you of anything." I am merely noting a discrepancy in public records that any competent attorney would find interesting. But you are right about one thing. I should be careful. I heard that people who are not careful around your interests tend to have accidents, like Silas Sinclair, for instance. Something shifted in the air. Gruber's hand moved toward his holster. The ranch hand adjusted his grip on his rifle. Behind Emmett, he heard Hadley's sharp intake of breath. Whitfield held up one hand, stilling his men. Then he looked at Emmett with an expression that was no longer contempt, but assessment, the calculation of a man encountering an obstacle he had not anticipated. "You have made yourself a target, Mr. Calloway, so I have been told." Whitfield remounted his horse with the fluid ease of a born rider. He looked down at Emmett from the saddle, his face hard as the mountain behind him. "Enjoy the view while you can. This land will be mine before spring." Then he rode away, his men following, leaving silence and the smell of horse sweat in their wake. Hadley appeared at Emmett's side. She was breathing hard, and when he looked at her, he saw something new in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, not warmth, but a recalibration, an acknowledgement that the man standing before her was not the useless paper pusher she had assumed. "You just painted a target on your back," she said. Emmett nodded. "He was your enemy before I arrived. At least now he knows you are not fighting alone." Hadley studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the valley, a hawk cried. Then she said quietly, almost reluctantly, "Come inside. Cora made stew. You should eat before you freeze." It was not kindness, not yet. But it was an opening, a door left slightly ajar, and Emmett walked through it. That evening around the table, something shifted in the household's dynamics. The four of them ate together for the first time, Emmett included, not as a guest or an intruder, but as a participant in the life of the homestead. Cora asked him about Boston, about what the ocean looked like, about whether it was true that buildings could be 10 stories tall. Wren pretended not to listen, but stopped her knife sharpening long enough to hear his answers. Hadley said little, but she did not leave the table, did not retreat to her room, did not dismiss him back to the barn when the meal was done. Later, as Emmett read by the firelight, a habit he maintained despite the barn's poor lighting, by bringing his book inside for the evening hour, Hadley allowed Wren appeared at his elbow so silently he startled. "What is that word?" she said, pointing to a line of text. She spoke it like a demand, like a challenge, but Emmett heard what was underneath. The frustration, the shame, the hunger to know something that everyone else seemed to know already. "Mountain," he said, turning the book so she could see. "Mountain, like where you live." Wren stared at the letters. Her gray eyes moved across them with the intensity of someone trying to crack a code. Then she looked at him, and in that glance, Emmett saw something he recognized, the furious pride of a person who refused to admit how much they needed help. "I knew that," she said, and walked away. But the next night she appeared again, and the night after. And slowly, secretly, in the margins of their shared evenings, Emmett began to teach the youngest Sinclair's sister to read. The first major storm of winter arrived on a Tuesday. By Monday evening, the air had changed, growing dense and electric, carrying the metallic scent that Hadley said meant snow within 24 hours. By Tuesday morning, the sky had disappeared behind a wall of gray so absolute it felt like the world had been sealed in a box. The snow came sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the mountain passes and shook the cabin's solid walls. Within hours, the trail to town was impassable. The world contracted to the homestead and the 100 yards of visibility around it, and four people were locked together inside a cabin not built for four. Those 3 days in the storm changed things in ways none of them expected. On the first evening, with the wind howling outside and the fire throwing shifting shadows across the walls, Emmett told them about Nell. He had not planned to. The story came out the way storms come, gathering slowly and then arriving all at once. He told them about his sister, 22 years old, with the same blue-gray eyes and a laugh that could make strangers smile, about the tuberculosis that took her in slow increments, stealing her breath, then her strength, then her voice, then everything, about sitting beside her bed at the end, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallower and the spaces between breaths grew longer, until finally there was a space that never ended. He told them about her last letter, written in a hand so weak the words barely held to the page. Find a place where they judge a man by what he does, not what others say about him. And about how that letter had led him here, to this mountain, to this cabin, to 3 women with rifles and no patience for weakness. When he finished, the cabin was quiet except for the storm. Cora was crying openly, tears running down her cheeks into the cup of tea she had forgotten she was holding. Wren sat very still in her corner, her knife in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls. Hadley spoke. Her voice was rougher than usual. Our father's name was Silas. He built this homestead from bare ground. Every log in these walls he cut and placed himself. Every stone in that chimney he carried from the creek bed. He taught us everything. How to ride, how to shoot, how to read the weather and the land and the animals. He was not a soft man, but he was a good man. The kind of man who shook your hand and you knew his word was the same as a contract. She paused, and in the firelight, Emmett saw the girl she must have been before grief and responsibility aged her decades. He was killed when I was 22. The official story was a riding accident. His horse threw him, and he fell down a ravine. But horses do not throw experienced riders on trails they have ridden 1,000 times. And men do not die from falls that leave their faces beaten and their ribs broken in ways that hooves do not cause. I buried him myself, up on the hill behind the house, carried him on the mule because the ground was too steep for a wagon, dug the grave with my own hands in soil that did not want to move. Nobody came to help. Nobody in town would risk Whitfield's anger by being seen supporting us. The words settled in the room like stones dropped into water, rippling outward, touching everything. Then Wren spoke. She spoke so rarely in anything more than sharp sentences that the sound of her voice in extended speech made everyone turn. She was looking at the fire, not at any of them, and her words came out flat and precise, stripped of all the wildness and defiance that usually armored her. I was there. When they killed him, I was 14. I had followed him that morning because I wanted to help with the fence line he was repairing near the ravine. He told me to stay home. I did not listen. Her jaw tightened. I was hiding in the brush when Whitfield's men came. 3 of them, Gruber and 2 others. They argued with Father about the boundary line. Father stood his ground. He always stood his ground. Then Gruber hit him, and they all hit him, and they pushed him over the edge. And they stood there and looked down at where he fell, and one of them said, "That is what happens to men who do not know their place." The silence after her words was absolute. I have never told anyone, Wren finished. She looked at Emmett, and her gray eyes held 5 years of rage and pain and a child's helplessness compressed into something that burned. Now you know why I do not trust strangers. Emmett met her gaze. Now I understand why you are so brave, he said. Wren blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, that was not it. She opened her mouth, closed it, and turned back to the fire without another word. But something in the rigid line of her shoulders eased by a fraction. Cora, through all of this, held herself carefully. Emmett watched her and saw the moments when she almost spoke, almost added her own secret to the confessions being shared, almost let the burden she was carrying join the others on the table. But each time she pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself, swallowing the words before they could escape. Emmett said nothing. He had made a promise by the creek, and he intended to keep it. When the storm broke on the 3rd day and they dug their way out into a world made new by snow, everything between them had changed. The careful distance that had defined Emmett's first weeks, the outsider status, the transactional nature of his presence, had dissolved in the heat of shared stories and shared shelter. He was not family, not yet, but he was no longer simply a name on a document. That morning, as he walked the fence line to assess damage, Emmett found it. A section of fence had been cut, not broken by the storm, but deliberately severed. The cattle that should have been sheltered in the lower pasture had scattered into the wilderness. And on a fence post nailed with a single iron spike hung a wooden sign with words burned into its surface. Leave or burn. Emmett pulled the sign free. He stood in the snow with it in his hands, feeling the smooth wood, the charred letters, the weight of the threat they represented. He looked across the white valley toward where Whitfield's ranch lay, invisible beyond the ridgeline, and he understood with absolute clarity that this was not a game, that the man who had killed Silas Sinclair would not hesitate to kill again, that whatever legal cleverness Emmett brought to this fight, it might not be enough against someone who operated outside the boundaries of law. He carried the sign back to the cabin and showed it to Hadley. He did it before Wren could see, before the youngest sister's rage could be ignited into something reckless. Hadley held the sign and read the words, and Emmett watched the color drain from her face. For just a moment, behind the iron, behind the stubbornness, in the pride, he saw genuine fear. The fear of a woman who had already lost her father to this enemy and knew exactly what these words meant. "This is how it started with my father," she whispered. "First the warnings, then the fire, then death." Emmett took the sign from her hands and placed it on the table. Then he looked at her, this fierce woman who had carried her family on her back for 5 years, and he said something he had never expected to say to anyone. "They will have to get through me first." It was not a boast, not the empty bravado of a man trying to impress. It was a statement of fact spoken by someone who had lost everything already and had therefore lost the capacity for fear. Hadley stared at him, and in her eyes Emmett saw the first true crack in the wall she had built around herself. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust, which is where all trust begins. Outside, the snow glittered under pale winter sun. The mountains stood as they always stood, massive and patient, and utterly indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. And somewhere down in the valley, Douglas Whitfield was making plans that would bring fire and ruin to this mountain. But on this morning in this cabin, 4 people stood together over a threat carved in wood, and none of them were alone. The weeks after the threat on the fence post settled into a rhythm that was equal parts vigilance and labor. Emmett and Hadley agreed without discussion that Wren and Cora should not see the sign. The youngest sister's fury would drive her to do something reckless, and Cora, carrying her hidden burden, did not need another weight pressing down on her. So they burned the wooden plank in the fireplace one evening, watching the charred letters curl and blacken and vanish into ash, and they kept the secret between them like a stone lodged in the chest. But secrets, Emmett was learning, had a way of shaping everything around them, even when they remained unspoken. Hadley began sleeping lighter, rising at every sound in the night, checking the windows with her rifle close. Emmett took to walking the full perimeter of the property each morning before dawn, his boots crunching through crusted snow, his eyes scanning for tracks that did not belong to deer or elk. They moved through their days with the heightened awareness of people who understood that the next blow could come at any hour. It was during one of these early morning patrols, 2 weeks after the storm, that Emmett found the first dead animal. A young heifer, one of the 8 remaining cattle the sisters depended on for milk and eventual spring calving, lay on its side near the creek. Its body was bloated, its legs rigid foam dried around its mouth. Emmett crouched beside it and studied the ground. The creek water ran clear and cold as always, but upstream, wedged between rocks, where it would not be immediately visible, he found a burlap sack. Inside were the remains of something chemical, a powder that had partially dissolved, staining the rocks around it a faint yellowish green. They poisoned the water. He said it to Hadley in the barn, away from the others, keeping his voice level, even as anger moved through him like a current through wire. Hadley's face went hard. She walked to the creek, examined the sack, smelled the residue, and her expression darkened to the color of deep forest shadow. "This is arsenic," she said. "Rat poison. You can buy it at any general store without questions." She looked upstream toward the invisible boundary where Sinclair land met the vast holdings of Douglas Whitfield. "They are not just threatening anymore. They are killing our livelihood, one animal at a time." That week, they lost 2 more cattle and a dozen chickens. The pattern was careful, almost surgical. Enough damage to bleed the homestead slowly, not enough to constitute obvious murder of livestock that would draw attention from territorial authorities. Death by 1,000 cuts. Emmett understood. This was not the tactic of a man who wanted a quick victory. This was the tactic of a man who wanted to exhaust his enemy, to drain their resources and their will until surrender felt like relief. He had seen Cornelius Marsh use the same approach in Boston, burying Emmett under legal motions and character attacks, each one small enough to seem reasonable, all of them together forming a cage. "We cannot just defend," Emmett told Hadley one evening as they sat at the table after Cora and Wren had gone to sleep. "He cannot keep reacting to whatever Whitfield does next. We need to go on the offensive." "With what army?" Hadley said. Her voice was flat with exhaustion. She had spent the day hauling the remaining cattle to a fenced area closer to the cabin where the water could be monitored, and her body showed the toll. "We are 4 people on a mountain. He has 20 ranch hands, the sheriff, and half the town in his pocket. We have the truth, and we have the law if we can get it in front of the right judge." Emmett laid out his plan. He had been thinking about it for days, turning it over in his mind, the way he used to turn pages carefully and with attention to what lay beneath the surface. The Territorial Circuit Court would send Judge Howard Pendleton through the region in the spring. Pendleton was known as a fair man, uncorrupted, with a reputation for siding with homesteaders against land barons. If Emmett could assemble enough evidence before Pendleton's arrival, they could file formal charges against Whitfield for fraud, land theft, and complicity in the death of Silas Sinclair. But he needed more than the forged documents he had already identified. He needed the original records from the land office. He needed witnesses willing to speak against Whitfield. And he needed proof that the arsenic poisoning was connected to Whitfield's operation. Hadley listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring at the fire with an expression that Emmett could not fully read. Then she said, "If this fails, he will kill you. You understand that? He killed my father for less than what you are proposing." "Yes, and you are willing to risk that. Your father was killed for standing his ground. I would rather die standing than live on my knees. It is about the only thing Boston and Montana have in common." Something flickered across Hadley's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the suggestion that somewhere beneath the armor, something warm still existed. "Fine," she said. "Tell me what you need me to do." They started the next morning. Emmett rode to town on Birch, the patient mare arriving at the land office just as it opened. The clerk, a nervous young man named Pritchard, who sweated visibly whenever Whitfield's name was mentioned, was not happy to see him. "I need to examine the original homestead filings for the Sinclair property," Emmett said, removing his spectacles and cleaning them with deliberate calm. "Section 12, Township 4, Range 18. All records from 1862 through the present." Pritchard glanced toward the back room, as if expecting Douglas Whitfield to materialize from the shadows. "Those records are not available for public inspection, Mr. Calloway. Under Territorial Statute 14, Section 3, all homestead filings are public record and must be made available upon request during normal business hours." Emmett replaced his spectacles and looked at the clerk with the patient expectation of a teacher waiting for a student to arrive at the correct answer. "I can cite the full statute if you would prefer." Pritchard sweated. He stammered. He made excuses about records being filed in a different location, about needing permission from his supervisor, about the office being short-staffed. Emmett sat down in the wooden chair beside the counter and folded his hands. "I will wait." He waited 3 hours. Pritchard disappeared into the back room multiple times, almost certainly sending word to someone about the troublesome husband from the Sinclair homestead who was asking questions. But the law was the law, and eventually, with visible reluctance, the clerk produced a stack of yellow documents and placed them on the counter. Emmett worked through them with the meticulous attention of a man who had spent years binding books, handling fragile pages, understanding how paper aged and ink faded and truth preserved itself even when people tried to bury it. What he found confirmed everything he had suspected and revealed something he had not expected at all. The original homestead filing signed by Silas Sinclair in 1862 was clean and legitimate, but a second filing dated 1883, 1 year before Silas was killed, had been inserted into the record. This filing purported to show that Silas had transferred a portion of his land to the Elkhorn Development Company, an entity that Emmett could find no other record of in any territorial registry. The transfer document bore Silas's signature, but comparing it to the original filing, the forgery was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. And there was more. Tucked behind the fraudulent transfer was a geological survey report from 1882. Emmett read it twice to make sure he understood, and then a third time because understanding it changed everything. Silver, a substantial vein of silver ore running beneath the Sinclair property identified by a territorial geological survey, but never reported to the landowner. The report had been filed in the land office records, but marked as classified under an authorization code that traced back to the Territorial Land Commission, whose chairman in 1882 had been Douglas Whitfield. Emmett sat very still in the land office, the documents spread before him, and felt the shape of the entire conspiracy click into place with the precision of a book's spine settling into its binding. Whitfield had not killed Silas Sinclair over a land dispute. He had killed him for silver. Had discovered the geological survey, buried the report, forged transfer documents to create a paper trail for eventual seizure, and when Silas proved too stubborn to be driven off his land through legal manipulation alone, had arranged his death. Everything the Sinclair sisters had endured for 5 years, the isolation, the threats, the slow strangulation of their livelihood, All of it was about what lay beneath the ground they walked on every day without knowing. Emmett made careful copies of every document. He worked slowly, precisely, his bookbinder's hands recording each word and number, with the fidelity of someone who understood that these pages might be the difference between survival and destruction. When he finished, he thanked Pritchard with genuine courtesy, gathered his copies, and rode back to the mountain with the truth tucked inside his coat, pressed against the oilskin pouch that held his sister's last letter. He told Hadley that evening. He spread the copies on the table and walked her through each document, each forgery, each buried truth, building the case the way he would build a book page by page, binding evidence to evidence, until the whole structure held together with undeniable weight. Hadley did not speak for a long time after he finished. She stood at the table, her work roughened, hands flat on the wood, her head bowed, her chestnut hair falling forward to hide her face. When she finally looked up, there were tears on her cheeks. Emmett had seen Hadley angry, had seen her fierce and stubborn and hard as the mountain rock that sheltered her home. But he had never seen her cry. "He killed my father for silver," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "Not because of the land, not because of boundaries or water rights or any of the excuses he made. For silver that was under our feet the whole time." Emmett did not try to comfort her with words, did not offer platitudes about justice or the arc of the moral universe. He simply stood on the other side of the table and let her grieve the way he had sat beside Cora by the creek, the way Nell had taught him, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for someone in pain was simply remain present. After a while, Hadley wiped her face with her sleeve and straightened her spine. The tears were gone. In their place was something colder and sharper. "What do we do with this? We take it to Judge Pendleton. But we need more. We need witnesses. People who saw Whitfield's men on our land. People who know about the poisoning. Ideally, someone inside Whitfield's operation who can testify to what really happened to your father." Nobody will testify against Douglas Whitfield. They are too afraid. Then we need to make them more afraid of what happens if they do not. Finding allies in Elkhorn proved harder than finding evidence. Emmett visited Agnes Morrow, first the territory's midwife and herbalist, a woman in her 60s with a tongue like a whip and a heart that had been delivering babies and setting bones for 40 years. Agnes lived on the edge of town in a cottage that smelled of dried lavender and camphor, surrounded by herb gardens that lay dormant under winter snow. She listened to Emmett's account with her arms crossed and her sharp eyes fixed on his face, reading him the way she read the signs of approaching labor with practiced assessment. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I have been waiting for someone to fight that man for 20 years, she said finally. "Silas tried. It got him killed. What makes you think you will fare better?" "Because Silas fought alone. I am not alone." Agnes studied him. "You love that girl." Hadley. The directness of it caught Emmett off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, and found he could not deny what he had not yet admitted to himself. "I respect her," he said carefully. Agnes snorted. "Save the careful words for the courtroom. I have delivered too many babies and buried too many people to waste time on polite fictions." "You love her, and from what I can see, she is beginning to love you back, though she would sooner arm wrestle a grizzly than admit it." She uncrossed her arms. "Fine. I will help you find witnesses, but I want something in return. Name it. When Cora's baby comes, I want to be there. That girl has been hiding her condition from everyone, including her sister, and she is going to need proper care." Emmett went very still. "You know about Cora. I am the only medical woman within 50 miles, Mr. Calloway. Women in certain conditions have a way of finding me whether they mean to or not. I noticed the signs when she came to town for supplies last month. She did not buy anything for herself, but she lingered near the infant clothing display longer than a woman with no reason to would." Agnes was as good as her word. Over the following weeks, she quietly identified people in Elkhorn and the surrounding homesteads who had grievances against Whitfield. A rancher whose water rights had been diverted. A widow whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell his land. A former Whitfield ranch hand, old now and sick, who carried guilt like a tumor and welcomed the chance to excise it before death. It was this last man, a weathered soul named Cyrus Boone, who provided the testimony that would prove most devastating. Boone had been one of the 3 men present when Silas Sinclair was killed. He had not pushed Silas. That had been Gruber. But he had stood there and watched and said nothing for 5 years, and the weight of that silence was killing him as surely as the consumption that was eating his lungs. "I want to die clean," Boone told Emmett in Agnes's cottage, his voice a rattling whisper. "I stood by while a good man was murdered. Let me at least speak the truth before I go." Emmett recorded his testimony in precise handwriting, every detail, every name, every moment of the killing on the ravine. When Boone finished, the old man wept, and Emmett held his hand the way he had held Nell's and told him that the truth had power even when it came late. While Emmett built a legal case, the situation on the mountain grew more dangerous. The poisoning continued. 2 more cattle died. The trail to town was blocked twice by fallen trees cut deliberately at the base, not broken by wind. The attack came on a moonless night in late January. Emmett woke to the sound of breaking glass and Wren's sharp cry. A rifle shot had punched through the cabin window and buried itself in the opposite wall, 6 inches above where Wren had been sleeping. Before the echo died, 2 more shots tore through the door, splintering wood and sending fragments spinning through the dark. Hadley was on her feet before the third shot, her rifle already in her hands, her body moving with the muscle memory of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 5 years. She fired through the shattered window into the tree line, the muzzle flash illuminating her face in brief, terrible intervals of gold and shadow. Emmett grabbed Silas's old shotgun from the pegs above the door. He had fired it exactly twice before, both times missing his target by a margin that Wren had found hilarious. But he did not need to hit anything. He needed to make noise to create the impression that the cabin held more defenders than it did. He fired into the darkness, the recoil slamming his shoulder, and racked another shell and fired again. Wren had already slipped out the back window, moving through the snow with the silent speed of someone who knew every rock and tree and shadow on this mountain. She circled wide through the forest, coming up behind the attackers, and drove them toward the steep ravine on the eastern edge of the property, a slope of loose shale and ice that she navigated daily, but that strangers in the dark would find treacherous. 2 of the attackers lost their footing and tumbled down the slope, their horses screaming their curses echoing off the canyon walls. In the confusion, a final shot came from the tree line. Emmett felt the bullet before he heard it, a searing line of fire across his left shoulder that spun him sideways and dropped him to one knee. The pain was immediate and enormous, a white-hot wire drawn through his flesh, but the wound was shallow, the bullet cutting a furrow across the meat of his shoulder without penetrating deeper. Hadley's return fire drove the last attacker into the trees, and then there was silence, broken only by the distant sounds of horses retreating down the mountain, and Emmett's own ragged breathing as blood soaked through his shirt and dripped onto the cabin floor. Hadley knelt beside him with a lantern, and when she saw the blood, her hands shook. Emmett had seen Hadley face down armed men, had seen her work through blizzards and exhaustion and grief without flinching. But her hands shook now as she cut away his shirt and cleaned the wound and pressed clean cloth against the bleeding. "Do not die," she said, and her voice was not a command. It was a plea. The first plea Emmett had ever heard from Hadley Sinclair, and it told him more about what he meant to her than any declaration could have. He did not die. The wound was painful but not dangerous, and Agnes Morrow, summoned the next morning, stitched it closed with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had mended worse. But something between Emmett and Hadley had shifted in that moment when her steady hands trembled over his bleeding shoulder. The wall she maintained between them had cracked, and through the crack, something warm and terrified and unmistakably real had shown itself. After that, Hadley moved Wren's bed away from the windows and began sleeping by the door with her rifle across her knees. The sisters rotated night watches, and Emmett joined the rotation despite Hadley's initial objection that he could not shoot well enough to be useful. "I can see well enough to raise an alarm," he said, "and I would rather sit awake and useless than sleep through an attack." His refusal to be sidelined to accept the lesser role that his Eastern origins seemed to assign him was wearing down the last of Hadley's resistance. She watched him work, watched him haul water and chop wood with hands that had finally hardened to the labor, watched him study documents by candlelight until his eyes burned, watched him teach Wren her letters with a patience that never faltered, never condescended, never made the girl feel small for not knowing what others took for granted, and she began to trust him. Not all at once, not with dramatic declarations or sudden revelations, but in small ways that accumulated like snow. She started saving him the warmest spot by the fire, started asking his opinion on decisions about the homestead, started speaking to him in the evenings about things that had nothing to do with survival, about her father's stories, about the mountains in summer, about a dream she had once had of seeing the ocean. "I have never seen it," she told him one night. "The ocean. Father used to describe it from books he had read, but neither of us ever traveled further than Bozeman." "Is it really as big as they say?" "Bigger," Emmett said. "Standing on the shore, you cannot see the other side. It just goes and goes until it meets the sky and you realize how small you are and how vast the world is." He paused. Nell loved the ocean. We would walk along the harbor in Boston, and she would stand at the railing and watch the ships and make up stories about where they were going. She always wanted to travel. Never got the chance. "Maybe someday," Hadley said, and then caught herself as if the word someday implied a shared future she was not ready to name. One evening in early February, Fletcher Whitfield appeared at the edge of the property. He came alone on foot without the swagger of his father's men or the cold authority of Douglas himself. He was young, mid-20s, with the kind of good looks that came from wealth and ease rather than weather and work. But his face was drawn and his eyes were afraid, and he did not come closer than the fence line. Wren saw him first and reached for her rifle, but Cora stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Let him speak," Cora said, and something in her voice made both sisters turn to look at her. Fletcher spoke quickly, nervously, his words tumbling over each other like water over rocks. "My father knows about the baby. He found out and he has ordered me to deny everything. To say that you are lying, that you are the kind of woman who—" He stopped. Could not finish the sentence. Cora's face went pale, but her voice held steady. "Say it. Say what he wants you to call me." Fletcher shook his head. "I cannot. I will not." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts shame and anguish. "I am sorry, Cora, for everything, for being too afraid to stand by you, for letting my father control me, for all of it." "Then stand up to him," Cora said simply. Fletcher's shoulders dropped. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that carried the weight of a warning rather than an apology. "My father is planning something big, something for the spring. Do not be here when it happens." Before anyone could respond, he turned and walked back down the trail and disappeared into the trees. The warning hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, vague and ominous and impossible to ignore. That same week, Hadley discovered the truth about Cora. It happened on a cold morning when Cora fainted while feeding the chickens, and Hadley rushed to her side and opened her coat, and the evidence of 6 months of hiding was right there, unmistakable beneath the loose shirt Cora had been wearing. The silence was deafening. Hadley stood up slowly. Her face cycled through emotions so rapidly they blurred into each other. Shock, confusion, understanding, and then rage, white-hot and volcanic, directed not at Cora but at the invisible man responsible. "Who?" Hadley said. One word. A blade. Cora was crying, sitting in the snow with her arms around herself. "Fletcher," she whispered. "Fletcher Whitfield." The name detonated. Hadley's face went white and then red, and she turned toward the cabin where the rifle stood against the wall. Emmett stepped into her path. "Move," Hadley said. "No, I'm going to kill him." "No, you are not." Emmett kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering. "If you ride down to that ranch and shoot Fletcher, you will hang or be shot or be arrested, and Whitfield will have exactly what he has wanted for 5 years. Your land without a single Sinclair left to claim it." Hadley's gaze blazed with fury. "He touched my sister. He used her and abandoned her and left her carrying his child, and you want me to do nothing. I want you to fight smart instead of fighting dead. There is a difference between justice and revenge, and right now this family cannot afford revenge." Emmett did not move from her path. "Your sister needs you alive and free. That baby needs its family whole. And killing Fletcher Whitfield will not undo what happened. It will only give his father another weapon." For a terrible moment, he thought she would push past him. The fury in her was volcanic, straining against every ounce of control. Her fists clenched and unclenched. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Then Wren appeared. She had been in the barn and had heard the commotion, and she stood in the snow reading the scene with the quick intelligence of a survivor. "The baby is Fletcher's," Wren said. Not a question. Cora nodded, unable to speak. Wren walked to her sister, knelt in the snow, and put her arms around Cora. She held her without speaking, the wild girl who trusted no one, cradling her sister with a tenderness that Emmett had not known she possessed. Over Cora's shoulder, Wren looked at Hadley. Do not kill him, not because he does not deserve it, but because we need you here. Something in Hadley broke, not apart but opened the way, frozen ground cracks in early spring to let something grow. She dropped to her knees beside her sisters and gathered them both, and the three Sinclair women held each other in the snow, while Emmett stood apart, not intruding but present, a witness to pain he could not fix but refused to look away from. Later, after Cora had told the full story of Fletcher's secret courtship and his cowardly abandonment, after the tears and the anger had settled into the duller ache of acceptance, Emmett sat with Hadley by the fire. You stopped me, she said, from doing something stupid. I stopped you from doing something permanent. There is a difference. She looked at him for a long time. The firelight played across her face, softening the hard edges that 5 years of fighting had carved into her features. He touched my sister, she said again, quieter now. Used her and threw her away, and his father killed my father. The whole family is poison. Not all poison has to be fatal, Emmett said. Sometimes you survive it and build immunity. She almost smiled. That almost smile that had become the most important thing in his world. You always have an answer, she said. Drives me crazy. Good, you could use a little crazy in your life. This time the almost smile became a real one, brief and reluctant but genuine, and Emmett felt it land in his chest like a small warm stone. The escalation continued through February. Emmett returned from a supply run to find the trail blocked by 3 men on horseback, Gruber Whitfield's foreman and 2 hands. They sat their horses across the narrow path with the easy confidence of men who held power and knew it. Mr. Calloway Gruber said he was chewing tobacco and spoke around it with deliberate disrespect. Mr. Whitfield sends a message. Leave the mountain, take your things, and go back to Boston. The land office will have new filings by month's end declaring the Sinclair homestead abandoned. The Sinclair homestead is not abandoned, Emmett said. I am standing right here. Your wife, Gruber, laughed. Your wife is a piece of paper. No judge is going to honor a sham marriage between a fugitive from Massachusetts and a woman too stubborn to know when she is beaten. The word fugitive hit like a punch. Gruber saw it land. Oh yes, we know about Boston, about the charges, about the money you stole from that school. Interesting, a wanted criminal hiding in a contested homestead. I stole nothing. The charges are false. That is what they all say. Gruber leaned forward. Here is what happens next, school teacher. You ride up that mountain, pack your books, and disappear tonight. If you are stupid enough to wait, things get unpleasant for everyone up there. Those women, that unborn baby, all of them. The threat against Cora and her child turned something cold and hard inside Emmett. He looked at Gruber and the armed men and calculated. He could not fight them, could not outrun them, could not bluff past them. So he did the one thing they did not expect. He agreed. You are right, he said, letting his shoulders slump, letting defeat soak into his voice. I will go. Tonight. Just let me say goodbye. Gruber studied him with suspicious eyes, but the performance was convincing because it drew on real exhaustion, real fear, real doubt. Finally, the foreman nodded. Smart choice. They moved aside. Emmett rode up the mountain with his heart pounding and his mind working faster than it had ever worked because he had no intention of leaving. That night, he told Hadley everything and his plan. We are not going to wait for Pendleton. We move tonight. Whitfield thinks I am leaving, which means his guard is down. I need to get into the land office before his people file documents declaring this homestead abandoned. You want to break into the land office. I want to remove fraudulent documents before they become official. There is a difference. This is reckless. Everything worth doing is reckless. Your father homesteading this land was reckless. You raising your sisters alone was reckless. Sending for a stranger from Boston was reckless. Sometimes reckless is the only sane response to an insane situation. She almost smiled. Fine, but I am coming with you. They rode down the mountain at midnight. Hadley on Ghost, her father's sure-footed gray who knew the trails in darkness. Emmett on Patient Birch. The moon was half full, casting enough light to see, but not enough to be seen. The cold was brutal. The town was dark when they arrived. Emmett picked the lock with tools from his bookbinding kit's slender metal instruments designed for precision that transferred perfectly to defeating simple frontier locks. Inside, working by shielded lantern light they found the new filing documents already prepared on Pritchard's desk. A declaration of abandonment, a transfer of title, a notation that Emmett Calloway had departed voluntarily. Emmett took the fraudulent documents. In their place, he left copies of the original filings, the Geological Survey, and Cyrus Boone's signed affidavit. He also left a letter addressed to Judge Pendleton requesting an emergency hearing. As additional insurance, he had already sent duplicate copies to Agnes Morrow for safekeeping and to the Territorial Secretary's office in Helena by post, ensuring that no single location could be compromised to destroy the evidence. "If anything happens to me," he told Hadley, "as they rode back, these documents will speak for themselves. Pendleton will see them. The truth is on the record now." They reached the homestead at dawn, exhausted and frozen, to find Wren waiting on the porch with her rifle and a furious expression. "Where were you? I woke up and both of you were gone, and Cora is having pains." The last three words sent ice through Emmett's veins. They rushed inside to find Cora on her bed, her face drawn with pain, her hands gripping the blankets. Agnes was not there, would not be for hours, even if someone rode immediately. The contractions started before midnight. Cora gasped. I tried to wait. I thought they would stop. "Something is wrong. It is too early. I am only 7 months." Hadley took command, boiled water, gathered linens, sent Wren to heat stones. But when she looked at Emmett over Cora's body, he saw fear she would not let her sister see. Emmett moved to Cora's side. He had read medical texts during the long months of Nell's illness, desperate to understand what was happening to his sister, searching for treatments the doctors had not tried. He was no physician, but he knew more than nothing, and right now, more than nothing was what they had. "Cora," he said, taking her hand, "look at me. I need you to breathe slowly. The baby is early, but babies born at 7 months can survive. We are going to get through this." Hours passed, the contractions intensified. Hadley followed Emmett's instructions with focused precision. Wren kept the fire roaring and the water hot, her face pale but her hands steady. When the moment came, when Cora bore down with a scream that echoed off the walls, Emmett saw the problem. The cord wrapped around the baby's neck, a blue-white loop pulsing with each heartbeat, tightening with each push. His bookbinder's hands, trained for precision, for threading needles and aligning spines and handling fragile things, moved with steady purpose. He eased the cord over the baby's head, gently, carefully feeling the tiny throat beneath his fingers, the impossible fragility and stubbornness of new life. The baby slipped free. One terrible moment of silence. Then a thin, reedy cry broke through and the cabin erupted. Cora sobbing, Hadley gasping, Wren making a sound between a laugh and a prayer. A girl, small, too small, but alive, pink and furious and determined. Emmett wrapped the infant and placed her on Cora's chest. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining, leaving him hollowed out and trembling. He stepped back and found Hadley watching him from across the room. Her eyes were wet, her composure had cracked, and through the cracks, he saw everything she had been hiding since the day he arrived. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that she had been fighting with all the stubbornness of a woman who had learned that loving people meant losing them. Cora held her daughter and wept. Wren knelt beside them, the wild girl transformed by tenderness. And Emmett walked out to the porch, sat on the steps in the cold morning light, and for the first time since Nell died, he cried. Not from sadness, from relief, because this time he had saved someone. Hadley came and sat beside him. She did not speak. She placed her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that until the sun climbed high enough to warm them. Cora named the baby Nell. When Emmett heard, he could not speak, could only nod, his eyes blurring, as the name of the sister he had lost was given to the life he had helped bring into the world. The next morning, as the household settled around the miracle of the new baby, Emmett walked outside and looked across the valley. The snow-covered landscape stretched white and vast in every direction. And on the trail leading up the mountain, a column of riders was approaching. 6, 7, perhaps 8 horsemen, and at the front, unmistakable, even at distance, the silver-haired figure of Douglas Whitfield. Beside him rode a man Emmett recognized with a sickening lurch. Cornelius Marsh, the headmaster from Boston who had destroyed his life here in Montana, 1,000 miles from where he had any right to be. And beside Marsh, a third figure, older, wearing a dark suit, carrying a leather case. A man whose bearing spoke of authority. Emmett turned back to the cabin. They are here, all of them, and they have brought what looks like a judge. Hadley's face hardened to stone. She took up her rifle and walked to stand beside him. Then we meet them standing, she said, and her hand found his briefly fiercely before she stepped forward to face whatever was coming. Behind them, Baby Nell cried, and the sound carried across the morning like a declaration. They came up the mountain in a column that looked more like an invasion than a legal proceeding. Douglas Whitfield rode at the front, his silver hair catching the winter sun, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had never allowed a fight to be fair. Cornelius Marsh sat his rented horse with rigid discomfort. His thin face pinched his eyes, calculating. The third man, the one with the leather case, dismounted with practiced ease. He was in his 50s, gray-bearded, wearing a dark wool suit. A brass badge identified him, and Emmett's stomach dropped when he read it. Judge Harlan Briggs, Territorial Court. Behind them rode the Sheriff of Elkhorn, a man named Polk, whose loyalties Whitfield had purchased years ago, and 4 armed ranch hands who spread along the tree line with casual menace. Emmett stood on the porch with Hadley beside him. Through the cabin's open door, he could hear Wren moving quietly, positioning herself near the window with her rifle. Cora was in the back room with baby Nell, 12 hours old and already under threat. Mr. Calloway Whitfield called as he dismounted. I thought we had an understanding. I reconsidered. Whitfield smiled. Unfortunately, reconsideration is no longer an option. Judge Briggs has reviewed the evidence. He gestured. Judge, if you would. Briggs stepped forward, opening his leather case. Emmett Calloway, he began with flat formality. I have before me a warrant for your arrest issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on charges of embezzlement and flight. Mr. Cornelius Marsh has provided sworn testimony. Under territorial cooperation statutes, I am authorized to execute this warrant. The words fell like stones. Furthermore, Briggs continued, I have reviewed the homestead filings and determined that the marriage between Emmett Calloway and Hadley Sinclair constitutes a fraudulent arrangement. The marriage is hereby annulled. The homestead claim is declared void. The property reverts to territorial jurisdiction. That is not your authority, Emmett said. Homestead disputes fall under federal land office jurisdiction, and extradition warrants from other states require confirmation by a federal magistrate. Briggs flushed. I assure you my authority is sufficient. Your authority, Emmett said, is whatever Douglas Whitfield paid for it. Silence. The kind that precedes violence or revelation. Whitfield's smile disappeared. Polk's hand moved to his holster. That is a dangerous accusation, Whitfield said, his voice stripped of polish. It is a factual observation. Emmett stepped off the porch, keeping his hands visible. Judge Briggs was appointed 3 years ago with support from the Elkhorn Development Company, an entity that exists on paper only and is wholly owned by you. His campaign was funded by contributions tracing directly to your ranch accounts. This is documented in the Territorial Secretary's office in Helena. Briggs went pale. Emmett turned to Marsh. Mr. Marsh, you have come a long way to perpetuate a lie. Marsh straightened. The charges against you are legitimate. The charges you fabricated. Emmett removed a packet of papers from his coat. Before I left Boston, I entrusted copies of the school's real financial records to David Alcott, who taught mathematics and independently noticed discrepancies in accounts you managed. Those records show that over 18 months, $3,400 was diverted into a private account bearing your name. Not mine. Yours. Marsh's composure cracked. His face went the color of old snow. Alcott was dismissed because he asked questions you could not answer. Emmett continued, but he kept the records. Last month, at my written request, he submitted them to the Massachusetts Attorney General. You might want to consult your own lawyer when you return to Boston. The dynamic shifted. Emmett could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Whitfield sensed it too. This changes nothing. Whitfield said, but his certainty had cracked. The homestead claim is invalid. My legal right to this land is established. Your documents are forgeries, and I can prove it. I have the originals. I have the geological survey you buried showing silver deposits under this property. I have a sworn statement from Cyrus Boone describing how your men murdered Silas Sinclair on your orders. And all of this evidence is in the Elkhorn Land Office, addressed to Judge Pendleton, with copies at the Territorial Secretary's office and in the possession of Agnes Morrow. You cannot destroy it without erasing every copy in 3 locations. Whitfield went still, the stillness of a predator recalculating. Then new hoofbeats broke through. From the south, trail riders emerged. At the front, an older man on a tall roan, his bearing erect with decades of earned authority. Behind him, two men in the long coats and silver badges of United States deputy marshals. And behind them, Agnes Morrow bundled against cold, her face fierce. What Emmett did not know, what he would learn only later, was that Agnes had been watching the trail from her cottage since before dawn. When she saw Whitfield's party ride through Elkhorn, heading for the mountain, she sent her neighbor's boy on the fastest horse in town to intercept Judge Pendleton, who had arrived in the territory 2 days early and was staying at the Helena Road Station, 30 miles south. Pendleton had ridden through the night. Judge Howard Pendleton pulled his horse to a stop and surveyed the scene. His gaze moved from Whitfield's armed men to Polk's nervous hand to Briggs clutching his leather case. Then his eyes found Emmett. Emmett Calloway, Pendleton said, "I received your letter and your evidence." He turned to Briggs. "Harlan, what exactly do you think you are doing here?" "Howard, there were warrants," Mr. Whitfield presented. "Mr. Whitfield does not have authority to present anything to any court in this territory. As of yesterday, I have issued an order suspending all pending actions related to the Sinclair homestead. Any rulings you have made are void, and if I find you accepted compensation, I will see you disbarred and prosecuted." Briggs mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Now Pendleton continued, turning to Whitfield. "Douglas, we have known each other a long time. I treated you as a man of standing." He removed a thick folder from his saddlebag. "This morning I reviewed the documents from the land office. The geological survey you concealed, the affidavit of Cyrus Boone describing the murder of Silas Sinclair." Pendleton's voice hardened. "I have also received independent confirmation from the United States Geological Survey that silver deposits exist beneath the Sinclair property, illegally classified, using your authority as Land Commission Chairman. This constitutes federal fraud." Pendleton also noted that documents seized from Whitfield's ranch office revealed a plan scheduled for early spring to file a mass claim through the Elkhorn Development Company and begin mining before any legal challenge could be mounted. Fletcher's warning to the Sinclair family had been more literal than any of them realized. Douglas Whitfield Pendleton said with the full weight of 30 years on the bench, "You are under arrest for the murder of Silas Sinclair, for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, for illegal seizure of mineral rights, for falsification of public records, and for criminal intimidation of territorial citizens." He looked at the deputy marshals. "Take him into custody." The outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Whitfield's ranch hands were armed. The marshals were outnumbered. In a different story, Whitfield might have ordered his men to fight. But this was not that story. The ranch hands looked at each other, looked at the federal badges, looked at Whitfield, and saw what he was. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Gruber was last to surrender. He sat his horse staring at Hadley with pure hatred. Then he looked at the marshals and the legal machinery finally pointing the right direction. He took his hand off his gun. Polk removed his badge and dropped it in the snow. The marshals moved forward. One took Whitfield's reins, the other collected weapons. As he was led past Emmett, Whitfield stopped. "A school teacher," he said. No anger, only baffled contempt. "I was brought down by a school teacher who cannot ride a horse. You were brought down by the truth. I just knew how to read it." Whitfield stared for a long moment, then turned away, and the marshals led him down the mountain, and the shadow that had hung over the Sinclair homestead for 5 years grew smaller until it vanished into the trees. Marsh attempted to slip away during the confusion. Pendleton's voice stopped him. "Mr. Marsh, you will remain in Elkhorn until transport to Massachusetts can be arranged to face charges filed against you there." Marsh sagged, did not look at Emmett, just stood in the snow in his fine Boston coat and waited to be collected. Agnes marched to the cabin. "Where is my patient?" she demanded. "I heard there was a baby born, and I was not consulted, and I am furious." Then came a sound that froze everyone. Whitfield, being led away, suddenly wrenched free of the marshal's grip. He pulled a pistol from inside his coat, a hidden weapon no one had found, and swung it toward the porch, toward Hadley. "If I cannot have this land, no one will." Emmett moved without thought, pure instinct. He threw himself between the gun and Hadley, shoving her sideways. The shot never came from Whitfield's barrel. Fletcher Whitfield, who had been standing at the edge of the clearing unseen, having followed his father's party up the mountain, lunged forward and struck the pistol from Douglas's hand. The gun discharged into the sky, the sound cracking across the valley like thunder. Fletcher stood over his father, his face white, his whole body shaking. "No," he said, "not anymore. You killed her father. I will not let you kill anyone else." The marshal seized Whitfield for the final time, securing him with irons. Douglas stared at his son with an expression that combined fury and something that might have been the faintest shadow of recognition that the boy he had raised to be a coward had in this one moment found the courage he had always lacked. Fletcher was arrested too. His involvement had been peripheral, more cowardice than villainy, and Pendleton was inclined toward leniency in exchange for cooperation. But before the sentencing, Fletcher came to the homestead one last time. Hadley met him at the gate with her rifle. Wren stood behind her with her knife. Cora said, "Let him speak." Fletcher looked at Cora, then at the bundle in her arms, and his face contorted. He did not ask to hold the baby, did not reach for her. "I am sorry," he said, "for everything, for my father, for what I did to you, for being too afraid when it mattered." "Your daughter's name is Nell," Cora said. "She will carry the Sinclair name. She will grow up on this land and this family, knowing her mother was strong enough to raise her alone." Fletcher flinched. "But she will also know," Cora continued, her voice softening, "that on the day Douglas Whitfield pulled a gun, his son knocked it away. She will know her father did one right thing, one brave thing, and that it counted." Fletcher's eyes filled. He stood looking at his daughter from a distance that was more than physical. Then he turned and walked down the mountain, and the Sinclair sisters let him go. The weeks that followed carried the strange quality that real resolution often has. No more confrontations, no more midnight rides, just the slow, steady work of justice and healing, which looked less like a story and more like ordinary life reasserting itself. Judge Pendleton conducted formal hearings. Emmett, Hadley, Agnes, and 3 other witnesses testified. Cyrus Boone gave his testimony from Agnes's cottage, too ill to travel. He died 11 days later peacefully. Emmett attended the funeral and laid a hand on the coffin and thanked a man he barely knew for courage that arrived just in time. The charges against Emmett were dismissed. Pendleton reviewed the evidence from David Alcott and declared the Massachusetts warrant fraudulently obtained. Emmett's name was cleared. The Sinclair homestead was confirmed as legal and undisputed property. The geological survey was declassified and mineral rights assigned to the landowners. The silver would not make them wealthy overnight, but it secured their future. Spring arrived gradually, snow melting and rivers green, appearing first in patches, then in carpets. Wildflowers bloomed. The remaining cattle fattened. Birds returned. Baby Nell grew her dark eyes, taking in everything with wide wonder. Emmett threw himself into the work of spring. His body had changed over the winter, hardened and adapted. He could split wood without thinking ride terrain that would have terrified him months ago, mend fences and repair roofing. Skills foreign to him when he arrived now felt natural, and he still taught. Every evening he and Wren sat by the fire and worked through her lessons. Her progress was remarkable. By April, she read full sentences. By May, she was working through the first of his books. One evening, Wren read an entire page aloud without stopping. When she finished, her gray eyes held something Emmett had never seen there. Not wildness, not defiance. Pride. Pure and hard-won. "I can read," she said. Simple words, but the tremor in her voice transformed them. "You always could. You just needed someone to show you how." Wren closed the book carefully, running her fingers along the spine the way he had taught her. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around him in a brief, fierce embrace that lasted 3 seconds and communicated more than years of conversation. "Thank you," she whispered. Then pulled away, cheeks flushed, and retreated to her corner with the book clutched against her chest. The armor was different now, not keeping the world out, but holding something precious in. The question of the marriage hung between Emmett and Hadley like wood smoke. They were legally married. The annulment Briggs attempted had been voided. On paper, husband and wife. In practice, something more complicated and more honest. They had not discussed what the marriage meant now that necessity had been resolved. The homestead was secure. Emmett's name was cleared. He could leave. The paper binding him to this mountain was no longer the only thing keeping him here. But he did not leave. Each morning he woke in the cabin and stepped onto the porch and watched light break over the mountains and felt certainty that had nothing to do with paper or law. He was where he belonged. Not because a document said so, but because every part of him recognized this place and these people as his own. Hadley brought the words into the open. She found him one afternoon on the hill behind the cabin, sitting beside Silas Sinclair's grave. Emmett had taken to visiting the grave on quiet afternoons, paying respects to the father of the woman he loved. Hadley sat down beside him. Wildflowers bloomed around the headstone, purple and yellow and white. Below the homestead, spread in miniature. Cabin with chimney smoke. Barn. Garden Cora was planting. Corral where horses moved in lazy circles. "I need to say something," she began. She was looking at the mountains, not at him, and her voice held a quality he had never heard. "Uncertainty. When you came here," she said, "I thought you were the weakest man I had ever seen. You could not ride, you could not chop wood, you could not shoot. Your hands were soft, and your clothes were ridiculous, and I thought we had made a terrible mistake." Emmett waited. "But you stayed," she continued, "when any reasonable man would have left. When Whitfield threatened you. When Marsh came with warrants and lies. When my sister was bleeding and afraid, and I did not know what to do, you stayed and you knew." She paused. "You stayed when it was hard and cold and dangerous and thankless, and you never complained, never asked for anything, never made me feel like accepting help meant owing you something." Wind moved through the wildflowers. A hawk circled above the valley. "I have spent 5 years telling myself I did not need anyone, that needing people was weakness, that the only person I could count on was myself. And then you showed up with your books and your spectacles and your soft hands, and you were the least likely person to change my mind, and you changed it about everything." She turned to face him, and her eyes held the full force of everything she carried. Not just pain and loss and 5 years of fighting, but a hope that had grown in spite of it all, stubborn as wildflowers pushing through mountain soil. "I love you," she said, "not because you signed a paper, not because you saved this land, not because my sisters need you or the homestead needs your name. I love you because you are the most genuinely good person I have ever known, because you taught my sister to read without making her feel small, because you held my other sister's baby with the same hands that held your dying sister's, and you did not break, because you stood between me and a bullet without thinking, and when I asked why, you said you would rather die standing than live on your knees, and you meant it." She reached for his hand. Her fingers were calloused and strong and warm, and when they closed around his, Emmett felt the last piece of something incomplete settle into place. "I want this marriage to be real," Hadley said. "Not a transaction, real, because you are real. And what I feel when I look at you is real, and I am done pretending it is not." Emmett looked at this woman, this mountain woman, with dirt under her nails and wildflowers in her hair, and the strength of the entire frontier in her spine. "It has been real for me since the night I sat by the creek and promised your sister I would keep her secret. Since the morning I found a threat nailed to a post and decided I would rather face it with you than run from it alone. Since the first time you almost smiled at me, and I realized that earning that smile was worth more than anything I had ever accomplished." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, tasting dust and work and mountain air. "I love you, Hadley Sinclair. I loved you when you pointed a rifle at me. I loved you when you told me to sleep in the barn. I loved you when you called me the weakest man you had ever seen, because even then I could see who you really were. And who you really are is the bravest, most beautiful, most stubbornly magnificent person I have ever had the privilege of standing beside." Her eyes were bright. She did not cry, but her eyes were very bright. "So we do this," she said. "For real. Together. Together." They held the ceremony on a Sunday in June on the porch of the cabin Silas Sinclair built with his own hands. Judge Pendleton officiated. Agnes Morrow appointed herself coordinator and managed proceedings with the same efficiency she brought to delivering babies. Cora baked bread and pies from the first garden fruits. Wren appeared in a cotton dress that had belonged to their mother, and when Hadley saw her, she had to turn away to compose herself. People came from town. Not many, but enough. Sarah Thornton, the general store owner's wife, who had slipped extra supplies into Sinclair orders during the worst months without charging. David Paulson, the blacksmith, who repaired their tools at cost. Mrs. Calloway from the boarding house, bringing a quilt with each square representing a different Montana wildflower. These were people who had formed the quiet resistance, who had helped in small ways when large ones were dangerous, who emerged now with the relief of those who no longer had to whisper their decency. Emmett stood at the porch railing in his best shirt, his spectacles polished. His hands no longer the soft hands of a Boston schoolteacher, but the weathered hands of a man who had learned to build things that lasted were steady at his sides. Hadley came through the cabin door and the world stopped. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Cora to fit her taller frame. Simple white cotton, yellowed with age lace at collar and cuffs. Her chestnut hair was down, falling past her shoulders in waves the wind immediately rearranged. Wildflowers threaded through the strands, purple and yellow and white, the same flowers growing around her father's grave. She carried no bouquet. She carried her father's Bible, the one Silas read every Sunday, the one whose spine Emmett had repaired with Bookbinder's tools during his first week, restitching binding that decades of use had loosened. Pendleton kept it simple. He spoke of commitment in courage, in love, forged in difficulty, of families built by choice, of homes defined by the people who refused to abandon them. Do you, Emmett Calloway, take this woman as your wife? Not in arrangement, but in truth and love, for as long as you both shall live. I do. Do you, Hadley Sinclair, take this man as your husband? Not because law requires it or land demands it, but because your heart has chosen him. I do. Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. And I pronounce this family, all of you, bound, not by law alone, but by something stronger. By the choice to stand together when standing alone would have been easier. Emmett kissed Hadley, gentle and brief tasting of wildflowers and wood smoke, and something earned through every kind of difficulty. When they parted, Hadley was smiling. A real smile, full and unguarded, the smile she had been building toward since a stranger in ridiculous shoes walked through her gate. The celebration lasted into evening. Someone produced a fiddle. Agnes revealed a talent for harmonica. People danced on packed earth boots, raising dust that caught golden light. Wren danced with the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man who looked at her with the terrified admiration of someone who recognized this girl could outfight him and definitely outrun him, and was still willing to let him hold her hand for the duration of a reel. Cora sat on the porch with Nell, watching with quiet contentment. Agnes settled beside her. That child is going to be something extraordinary, the older woman said. She has her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and her uncle's love of books, Cora said, watching Emmett whirl. Hadley, through a dance, neither performed with grace, but both performed with undeniable joy. He reads to her every night. She cannot understand a word, but she listens like she is memorizing everything. As the sun dropped and the sky turned from gold to violet to deep blue, guests departed. Wagons creaked down the trail. Voices called goodbye across distances, that frontier life placed between neighbors. Emmett stood on the porch with his wife and watched the last wagon disappear. Through the open door, Wren was reading aloud to Nell, her voice steady and proud, stumbling only occasionally. Cora hummed in the kitchen. "What are you thinking?" Hadley asked. She leaned against him, her shoulder fitting against his in the way that had become natural. "I am thinking about something Nell wrote in her last letter. She told me to find a place where they judge a man by what he does." He looked at the cabin, the mountains, the vast sky filling with stars. "I found something better. I found a place where they judge a man by what he is willing to become." Hadley took his hand. The calluses on her palm met the calluses on his, matching, now the same landscape of hard work mapped onto both their skins. "Welcome home, Emmett Calloway." And he was. The mountains stood as they always stood, patient and eternal. But the story was not small to the people living it. A cabin on a ridge, a garden coming to life, a baby sleeping in her cradle, a young woman reading her first book, two sisters who survived the worst and came out stronger, and a man from Boston who arrived with nothing but grief and books and a letter from his dead sister, who found in the wilderness not escape but arrival, not ending but beginning, not the death of the person he had been, but the birth of the person he was always meant to become. Summer deepened. The silver beneath the land waited patient as the mountains. Cattle grew fat. The garden flourished. Nell grew her dark eyes, taking in everything. Wren finished her first book and started her second. Cora's honey sold well in town, and she kept records in a ledger Emmett had bound from scrap leather and good paper. Every evening when work was done and the sun painted the mountains, the family gathered on the porch. Emmett read aloud. Hadley leaned against him. Wren argued about characters. Cora nursed Nell and added quiet observations that were always exactly right. Agnes appeared weekly with herbs and opinions, and stayed for dinner in the kind of companionship that sustained people where neighbors were a long ride away. They were not perfect. They argued and tested patience in all the ways families do. But beneath the friction, beneath daily negotiations of four adults and one infant in a cabin still not quite large enough, there was something unshakable. Something built on the foundation Silas laid and his daughters defended, and a gentle man from Boston helped secure. Home. Not a place, but a promise. The promise that you would show up, that you would stay, that you would fight for the people beside you, not because you had to, but because you chose to. Emmett had come west carrying a dead woman's letter and a broken man's shame. He had found in the most unlikely place with the most unlikely people the thing his sister wished for him with her dying breath. A life measured not by what others said, but by what he did, by the hands he held, by the fires he built, by the words he taught and the truths he uncovered, and the woman he loved and the family that chose him as surely as he chose them. The hawk circling above the valley still circled riding thermals with effortless grace. The creek still sang over stones. The mountains still held the sky. And on the porch of a cabin built by a good man's hands and defended by his daughter's courage, Emmett Calloway sat with his family as stars came out one by one and knew with absolute certainty that he had found his place. Not at a desk in Boston, not in a courtroom or schoolhouse. Here, on a mountain in Montana. With three women who taught him strength came in forms he never imagined, and a baby girl named for the sister whose final wish led him home. Night settled over the mountains. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. Outside, wilderness stretched vast and dark. And in between, in the small, bright circle of lamplight and love, this family built from nothing but will and trust. Emmett closed his book, kissed his wife, and let himself believe fully and without reservation that the best part of his life was not behind him. It was just beginning.